Old man travels to Norway as his dying wish, uncovering a Viking relic with unbelievable powers. When grumpy, retired janitor Maurice Vanderley, 79, learns he has 6 months to live, he uses his life savings to fulfill a childhood dream: visiting Norway. What starts as an awkward bucket list trip filled with tourist mishaps turns into a legendary adventure when Moss stumbles upon an ancient Viking relic in a crumbling cave. But the relic, a glowing hammer, doesn't just sit still. It hums, sparks, and suddenly, Moss finds himself wielding powers even Thor might envy. Maurice Vanderley sat in his worn recliner, scowling at the evening news. His remote control, a veteran of decades of button mashing, felt useless in his hand. Tonight, no amount of channel surfing could distract him from the gnawing truth. He was dying. Dr. Patel, his overly chipper physician, had delivered the news last week with an optimism that felt misplaced. 6 months, she had said, maybe 7 if he gave up bacon. Maurice had scoffed at the suggestion. A man had to draw the line somewhere. At 79, Maurice had seen enough of life to know it rarely offered second chances. He'd spent most of his years as a janitor at the local high school, scrubbing gum off desks, unclogging toilets, and enduring the cruel humor of teenagers who saw him as invisible. His colleagues had nicknamed him Grumpy Moss, but Maurice preferred realist. Life was messy, people were unreliable, and then you died. What was there to smile about? But now, with time slipping through his fingers, Maurice faced an uncomfortable question. What did he want to do before the end? The answer came unexpectedly, in the form of a crumpled travel magazine he found wedged in the couch. The cover showed Norway's fjords, their icy waters sparkling under a pristine blue sky. Maurice had always been fascinated by the Vikings, the fearless seafarers who braved uncharted waters. As a boy, he had dreamed of exploring their homeland. But dreams had given way to bills, mortgages, and the exhausting grind of daily life. Now, with little left to lose, the idea seemed to resurface. Booking the trip proved more challenging than he'd anticipated. Maurice, who had avoided computers like the plague, spent an hour yelling at his ancient laptop before surrendering. He called Kyle, his teenage neighbor who lived off energy drinks and video games. With the smug efficiency only a teenager could muster, Kyle had the trip booked in under 10 minutes. "You're really going to Norway, huh, Mr. Vanderley?" Kyle asked, his eyebrows raised. "Don't look so surprised," Maurice snapped. "I'm not in the grave yet." The flight to Oslo was an ordeal. Sandwiched between a bickering honeymoon couple, Maurice endured hours of petty squabbles about wedding photo angles and dinner reservations. The in-flight entertainment offered no solace, consisting entirely of romantic comedies that Maurice found intolerable. By the time the plane landed, he was irritable and exhausted. Norway's cold, crisp air greeted him like a slap to the face. His hotel room turned out to be barely larger than a closet, and the complimentary breakfast was a baffling array of pickled fish and bread so dense it could double as a doorstop. To top it off, the front desk clerk, though fluent in English, insisted on responding to Maurice's questions in rapid-fire Norwegian, leaving him feeling both out of place and mildly insulted. Determined not to let the trip be a total failure, Maurice signed up for a guided fjord tour. The group consisted of cheerful couples and retirees, led by Ingrid, a guide who seemed to have an endless supply of Viking anecdotes. Maurice found her enthusiasm grating and kept to the back, muttering about the exorbitant cost of the excursion. And then it happened. While the group busied themselves with selfies by the water, Maurice wandered off, seeking solitude. As he climbed a rocky hill, his foot struck something hard, sending him sprawling. Swearing under his breath, he sat up and turned to see what had tripped him. It was a stone tablet, half buried in the earth. Intrigued, despite himself, Maurice brushed off the dirt, revealing strange carvings. The symbols were unfamiliar, yet they seemed to hum with a quiet energy. Before he could examine it further, Ingrid's voice rang out, sharp and impatient. "Mr. Vanderley, where are you? We're leaving." Maurice rose with a groan, his knees protesting the movement. But as he trudged back to the group, he couldn't shake the feeling that the tablet was calling to him. It was a ridiculous thought, of course, the sort of nonsense he had no patience for, and yet, for the first time in years, Maurice felt a flicker of something he hadn't known he'd lost: curiosity. That night, Maurice lay in his narrow hotel bed, unable to sleep. The symbols on the tablet haunted him, vivid in his mind's eye. What did they mean? Why had the tablet been buried there? And why, out of all the tourists in Norway, had he been the one to find it? The questions buzzed in his brain, refusing to be silenced. The next morning, armed with a cheap flashlight he'd picked up at a convenience store, Maurice returned to the hill. The weather had turned miserable, with a cold drizzle soaking through his jacket, but he didn't care. He felt an urgency he couldn't explain, as though the tablet might vanish if he delayed. When he reached the spot, relief washed over him. The tablet was still there, its carvings intact. But as he bent to examine it, something extraordinary happened. The symbols began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter, until the entire tablet pulsed with light. Maurice stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. "What the hell?" he muttered, staring in disbelief. The glowing symbols were no illusion. They were as real as the cold ground beneath his feet. For the first time in decades, Maurice felt truly, unmistakably alive. Maurice stared at the glowing tablet, his breath visible in the chilly Norwegian air. The symbols, pulsating in an eerie rhythm, seemed to whisper in a language he couldn't comprehend. He thought about leaving it, but a strange pull rooted him to the spot, like invisible strings urging him to stay. With a grunt, he knelt to touch the tablet. The moment his fingers grazed it, a surge of warmth shot through him. Startled, he yanked his hand back. The glowing intensified, and the ground beneath him trembled. Maurice froze. "Oh, hell no," he muttered, scrambling to his feet as the tremor grew stronger. Before he could react, the tablet sank into the earth, disappearing as though swallowed whole. In its place, a circular stone slab emerged, its surface carved with intricate patterns resembling a map. Maurice blinked, unsure if he was hallucinating. He squinted at the symbols, trying to make sense of them, when a voice boomed behind him. "You shouldn't be here." Maurice spun around, nearly slipping. A tall man with piercing blue eyes and a thick beard stood a few feet away. He wore a fur-lined coat that looked like it belonged in a Viking museum. The man's expression was a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "I didn't mean to. Look, I just found it," Maurice stammered, gesturing at the slab. The man stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the stone. "You touched it, didn't you?" "Maybe," Maurice admitted, "but it wasn't intentional. I tripped, all right?" The man sighed. "You've awakened the callstone. Do you know what that means?" "Not a clue," Maurice replied, crossing his arms. The man studied him. "The callstone is an artifact of great power. It chooses its bearer. By touching it, you've been marked." "Marked?" Maurice repeated, irritated. "I don't even want the damned thing." The man ignored him. "My name is Eric. I guard these relics. The callstone has set a trial in motion, one you must complete. Refuse, and its power will grow unchecked." "Great," Maurice muttered. "No pressure or anything." The slab rotated, revealing a spiral staircase descending into darkness. A rush of cold air carried the scent of seawater. Maurice stared. "You've got to be kidding me." Eric shook his head. "The trial begins now. Only you can pass it." "What if I fail?" "Failure isn't an option," Eric said grimly. With a resigned sigh, Maurice descended the staircase, his flashlight barely piercing the gloom. The air grew colder, and the tunnel walls were slick with moisture. Glowing symbols lit the path, and Maurice couldn't shake the feeling he was being watched. At last, he reached a circular chamber. In its center stood a pedestal. atop which rested a small, ornate hammer. The room was silent, save for the faint hum emanating from the hammer. "Is this it?" Maurice muttered. He reached for the hammer, but as his fingers brushed it, the room transformed. The walls became the deck of a Viking ship, complete with crashing waves and howling wind. The transition was seamless, yet disorienting. Maurice stumbled, gripping the pedestal for balance. A booming voice echoed through the chamber. "Prove your worth, mortal!" Maurice looked around, baffled. How exactly am I supposed to do that? The chamber-turned ship lurched violently, throwing Maurice off balance. A massive wave rose on the horizon, growing taller with each passing moment. The ship creaked under the pressure as the wave loomed closer. Maurice's heart raced. "Of course, it's a damn metaphor," he muttered, gripping the hammer. Energy surged through him, an overwhelming mix of strength and clarity. The wave crashed, but instead of being swept away, Maurice found himself standing firm. The hammer glowed brightly, its light cutting through the chaos. The ship dissolved, and Maurice was back in the chamber. The voice softened. "You have passed the first trial. The path continues." Maurice blinked, struggling to process what had just happened. His hands trembled as he released the hammer, but its glow remained steady, as though silently approving of him. The pedestal began to sink into the floor, revealing another hidden passage. Eric's voice echoed from above. "Are you all right?" "No," Maurice called back, his voice cracking. "But I'm alive. For now." Eric descended the staircase, his expression unreadable. "You've done what many couldn't. But this is only the beginning. The Callstone's path will demand more from you." "More?" Maurice asked, incredulous. "I'm a janitor, not a damn superhero." Eric smirked. "The gods don't care about your resume. They care about your resolve. Rest while you can. The next trial will come soon." Maurice sighed, his exhaustion catching up to him. The weight of the hammer's glow seemed to linger in his chest, both a burden and a promise. Whatever lay ahead, he wasn't sure he was ready for it, but something told him he didn't have a choice. As Eric led him back up the staircase, Maurice stole one last glance at the chamber below. The symbols on the walls flickered faintly as though watching him leave. Whether they were encouraging or warning him, he didn't know, but he had a sinking feeling that his life had just taken a turn he couldn't undo. Maurice woke up the next morning with a pounding headache and a dull ache in his knees. He had half convinced himself that the events of the previous day were some bizarre fever dream, but the faint hum of the Callstone's energy in his chest told him otherwise. Eric stood by the window of the small lodge they had returned to, gazing out at the mist-shrouded fjords. "You're up," Eric said without turning around. "Barely," Maurice grumbled, rubbing his temples. "You got any aspirin?" Eric smirked. "You'll need more than aspirin for what's coming." Maurice sighed, his irritation flaring. "Do you ever talk like a normal person? What's coming now? Another glowing rock? A talking raven?" Eric ignored the sarcasm. "The second trial. The Callstone's path is not random. It follows a sequence. Each step reveals the next. Last night the hammer marked you as its bearer. Now, you must prove you're worthy to wield its power." "Great," Maurice muttered. "What does this one involve? More waves? Maybe a nice fireball or two?" Eric finally turned to face him, his expression serious. "The second trial will test your courage. It will take you deep into the heart of the mountains, to a place called the Hall of Echoes." "Sounds cozy," Maurice said dryly. Eric didn't respond. Instead, he handed Maurice a small satchel. "You'll need this." Maurice opened the bag to find a flask of water, a crust of bread, and what looked like a hand-drawn map. "This is it. No flashlight, no weapons, not even a granola bar." Eric chuckled. The gods don't care for modern conveniences. Maurice rolled his eyes but slung the satchel over his shoulder. "Fine. Let's get this over with." The journey to the Hall of Echoes was grueling. The path twisted through jagged cliffs and narrow ledges with nothing but the sound of the wind and the occasional screech of a distant bird to keep them company. Maurice's legs burned with every step, and he was certain Eric was deliberately walking faster than necessary. "Do you do this for fun?" Maurice huffed, struggling to keep up. Eric glanced back, unbothered by the climb. "It's not about fun. It's about purpose." "Well, my purpose is to not die on this stupid mountain." Eric smiled faintly but said nothing. After what felt like hours, they reached the entrance to a massive cave. The air inside was cold and damp, and a faint glow emanated from deep within. "This is it," Eric said. "The Hall of Echoes." Maurice hesitated. "What exactly am I supposed to do in there?" Eric gestured toward the cave. "The trial will reveal itself. Trust the callstone. It will guide you." Maurice muttered a string of curses under his breath but stepped into the cave. The glow grew brighter as he ventured deeper, the walls covered in ancient runes that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. The passage opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness. At the center of the chamber stood a massive stone archway, its surface shimmering like water. Maurice approached cautiously, the callstone's hum growing louder with each step. "Come closer," a voice echoed from the archway. Maurice froze, his pulse quickening. "Who said that?" he called out, his voice trembling despite himself. The archway shimmered and a figure stepped through, a younger version of himself. Maurice stared, his mouth dry. "What? What is this?" The younger Maurice smirked. "Oh, come on, old man. Don't tell me you've forgotten what you looked like." "This isn't real," Maurice said, shaking his head. "It's some kind of trick." "Maybe," the younger Maurice said, circling him. "Or maybe it's the truth you've been avoiding. Look at you, bitter, angry, clinging to excuses. You've spent your whole life running from everything that mattered." "Shut up," Maurice snapped. "You don't know me." "I am you," the younger Maurice shot back. "And I know exactly what you're afraid of. You're not here because you're brave. You're here because you're scared of dying without meaning anything." Maurice's hands clenched into fists. "You don't know what I've been through." "Then prove it," the younger Maurice said, stepping back toward the archway. "Step through and face what you've been running from." Maurice hesitated, his heart pounding. The archway rippled, its surface reflecting flashes of moments from his past. His mother's funeral, his first job, the night he walked away from the woman he loved. Each memory hit him like a punch to the gut. "You're stronger than you think," the younger Maurice said softly. "But you have to believe it." With a deep breath, Maurice stepped through the archway. The sensation was overwhelming, a rush of cold air, a blinding light, and then silence. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the chamber, the archway gone. Eric was waiting at the entrance. "You made it." "Barely," Maurice said, his voice hoarse. "What the hell was that?" "The Hall of Echoes shows you your greatest fears," Eric said, "and forces you to confront them. You passed." Maurice sank to the ground, exhausted. How many more of these trials are there? "Enough," Eric said with a faint smile. "Rest now. The third trial will come soon." Maurice sat cross-legged on the rocky ground, trying to convince himself he wasn't entirely out of his depth. The callstone's hum had grown stronger since the last trial, vibrating faintly in his chest like an unsettling second heartbeat. Eric, ever stoic, stood nearby, sharpening a small blade as if preparing for a battle Maurice wanted no part of. "So, what's next?" Maurice asked, breaking the silence. "Another chat with my younger, jerkier self?" Eric glanced up. "The third trial is different. It will test your resolve, not just your courage." "Fantastic," Maurice muttered. "More cryptic nonsense." Eric ignored him and gestured toward the jagged path ahead. "The third trial awaits in the Valley of Shadows. It is said to be the most dangerous of all. Many have failed there." Great, Maurice said, standing with a groan. Let me guess. It's full of giant spiders or man-eating wolves? Eric didn't answer, which did nothing to calm Maurice's nerves. They began their descent into the valley, the air growing colder with every step. The terrain shifted from rocky cliffs to dark, twisted trees that clawed at the sky. The sun barely penetrated the thick canopy above, casting the path in an eerie twilight. Maurice trudged behind Eric, grumbling. Why does everything have to be so dramatic? What happened to a crossword puzzle or a nice cup of tea? Eric smirked but didn't respond. The silence between them grew heavier as they ventured deeper. Shadows seemed to move at the edge of Maurice's vision, darting between the trees. He told himself it was just his imagination, but the callstone's hum felt more insistent, as if warning him of an unseen danger. They reached a clearing where a large stone altar stood, surrounded by ancient carvings. Eric stopped and turned to Maurice. "This is where I leave you." "Leave me?" Maurice asked, his voice rising. "What do you mean, leave me?" "The third trial is yours alone," Eric said. "It will challenge your willpower and test the strength of your heart." Maurice wanted to argue but bit his tongue. With a reluctant nod, he stepped toward the altar. The carvings seemed to glow faintly as he approached, their patterns shifting like liquid. The callstone's hum became almost deafening, resonating in his ears and chest. As Maurice placed his hands on the altar, the world around him dissolved into darkness. He blinked, disoriented, as a deep voice echoed in the void. "Do you fear the shadows, mortal?" Maurice frowned. "I fear a lot of things, pal. Care to be more specific?" The voice ignored his sarcasm. "The shadows hold the truth of your past. You must walk through them to find the light." Before Maurice could respond, the darkness around him began to shift. Shadows took shape, forming into ghostly figures that surrounded him. They whispered in hushed tones, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Maurice turned in a circle, trying to make sense of the swirling figures. "What is this? Some kind of twisted seance?" The shadows grew clearer, their faces becoming recognizable. Maurice froze as he saw his mother, her expression filled with disappointment. Next to her stood an old friend he hadn't spoken to in decades, and behind them was a woman he had loved but pushed away. Each figure stared at him, their eyes full of unspoken accusations. "You ran from us," his mother's voice said, cutting through the chaos. "You ran because it was easier than facing the truth." Maurice's chest tightened. "That's not true. I didn't know what to do." The shadows moved closer, their whispers growing louder. "You abandoned those who needed you. You chose comfort over courage." "Stop it," Maurice said, his voice cracking. "You don't understand." "Then show us," the voice from the void said. "Show us your strength." Maurice clenched his fists, the callstone's hum vibrating in his core. "You want strength? Fine. I'm still here, aren't I? I've made mistakes, sure, but who hasn't? I'm not perfect, but I'm not a coward." The shadows paused, their whispers fading. The darkness began to recede, replaced by a soft, golden light. Maurice stood alone in the clearing, his breathing ragged but steady. The deep voice returned, calmer this time. "You have faced the shadows and found your truth. The light within you grows stronger. The path continues." The golden light enveloped Maurice, and when it faded, he was back at the altar. Eric stood nearby, watching him with a mixture of relief and approval. "You did it," Eric said. "Barely," Maurice replied, his legs feeling like jelly. "What the hell was that?" "The shadows reflect your deepest regrets," Eric explained. "Only by facing them can you move forward." Maurice sank to the ground, his exhaustion catching up to him. "Is this what you do all day? Watch people nearly have a heart attack in caves and forests?" Eric chuckled. "It's not for everyone." Maurice shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "What's next?" or do I finally get to retire? The path isn't over yet, Eric said, but you're closer than you think. Maurice woke up to the sound of distant thunder. The air in the camp was heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that matched the storm clouds gathering above the valley. Eric stood by the fire, sharpening a blade that looked far older than anything Maurice had seen before. "What's the plan today?" Maurice asked, groaning as he sat up. His muscles ached from the previous trial and his mind felt just as bruised. Eric didn't turn around. "The fourth trial awaits. It will test your loyalty." "My loyalty?" Maurice scoffed. "To what? The callstone? You?" Eric turned, his expression unreadable. "Loyalty to what you stand for, to those who matter, to yourself." Maurice rolled his eyes. "Great, another trial with metaphors and riddles. Can't wait." Eric ignored the sarcasm. "This one is different. You'll need to choose, and the choice will have consequences." The trail they followed led out of the valley and up into the mountains. The air grew thinner, and Maurice struggled to keep up with Eric's relentless pace. He stumbled more than once on the rocky path, cursing under his breath each time. "Slow down, will you?" Maurice huffed. "I'm not built for mountain climbing." Eric glanced back but didn't slow. "The trial waits for no one." "That's convenient," Maurice muttered. "Not even for an old man with bad knees." They reached a plateau where the trail ended abruptly at the edge of a cliff. Below them stretched a dense forest, its canopy so thick it looked like an unbroken sea of green. In the distance, Maurice could make out the faint shimmer of a lake. "This is it?" Maurice asked, looking around. "Looks peaceful enough." Eric pointed to a small weathered bridge spanning the chasm between their plateau and another rocky outcrop. "Your trial begins there." Maurice squinted at the bridge. It didn't look particularly sturdy, with planks missing and ropes frayed from years of exposure to the elements. "You've got to be kidding me." Eric didn't respond. Instead, he stepped aside, revealing a small boy hidden behind a cluster of rocks. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "What's this?" Maurice asked, confused. "The boy is part of your trial," Eric said. "He must cross the bridge, and you must decide how." Maurice frowned. "What do you mean, how?" Eric gestured to the bridge. "You can carry him, but doing so will make the bridge unstable. Or you can guide him, trusting him to follow your instructions." Maurice sighed. "This is ridiculous. What happens if the bridge collapses?" "The boy will fall," Eric said simply. "And so will you." "Fantastic," Maurice muttered. He knelt before the boy, who clutched a small wooden toy in his hands. "Hey, kid, what's your name?" The boy didn't answer, his grip tightening on the toy. "Great," Maurice said, standing. "A silent partner, just what I needed." He turned to Eric. "And there's no other way across." Eric shook his head. "The trial is the path." Maurice looked at the bridge, then at the boy. His first instinct was to carry the child. The bridge didn't look sturdy enough for one person, let alone two, but at least he'd have control. On the other hand, the kid was light, and if he followed directions carefully, maybe they'd both make it. "Listen, kid," Maurice said, crouching again. "You're going to have to trust me. I know it's scary, but we can do this." The boy nodded slowly, gripping his toy tighter. Maurice stepped onto the bridge first, testing each plank carefully. The wood groaned under his weight, but it held. "Okay, follow me. Step where I step, and don't look down." The boy hesitated but took a tentative step onto the bridge. Maurice moved slowly, keeping his eyes on the boy. Each step felt like an eternity, the ropes creaking ominously with every movement. "Almost there," Maurice said, his voice steady despite the sweat dripping down his face. "Just a few more steps." The boy froze halfway across, his eyes wide with fear. The bridge swayed dangerously, and Maurice felt his heart leap into his throat. "Hey, look at me," Maurice said, his tone firm. "You can do this. Just one step at a time. I won't let you fall." The boy nodded, his movements shaky but determined. He took another step, then another, until finally they both reached the other side. Maurice collapsed onto the ground, his legs trembling. The boy stood beside him, silent but safe. "You chose well," Eric said, stepping onto the plateau. "Loyalty is not just about sacrifice. It's about trust." "Yeah, well, my knees didn't appreciate it," Maurice muttered. He looked at the boy, who gave him a small, hesitant smile. "What happens to him now?" "He will find his path, as you must find yours," Eric said. Maurice watched as the boy walked toward the trees, disappearing into the forest. "I hope he gets an easier path than mine." Eric smiled faintly. "Few do." Maurice sighed, pushing himself to his feet. "What's next? Or do I get a break?" Eric's smile faded. "The next trial will be the hardest yet. Rest while you can." Maurice awoke to a sky painted in fiery reds and oranges. The storm clouds of the previous day were gone, leaving the mountains bathed in an unnatural glow. Eric stood nearby, arms crossed, staring at the horizon with an expression Maurice hadn't seen before, concern or maybe resignation. "This is it, isn't it?" Maurice said, sitting up with a groan. His body felt like it had aged 10 years in the past week, and he wasn't sure how much more he could take. Eric nodded. "The final trial. The Callstone's path ends here." Maurice sighed, pulling on his boots. "Do I at least get a hint this time? Or am I walking blind into another death trap?" Eric's expression darkened. "The trial of sacrifice will demand everything. Your strength, your resolve, your heart." Maurice chuckled bitterly. "Everything, huh? Doesn't leave me with much, does it?" Eric didn't respond. Together, they began the climb toward the summit. The air grew thinner with every step, and Maurice's lungs burned as he struggled to keep up. The Callstone's hum, which had become a constant presence, was now almost deafening. When they reached the top, Maurice froze. Before him stood a massive stone gateway, its surface carved with glowing runes. Beyond the gateway was nothing but a swirling void. "What the hell is that?" Maurice asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The gateway to the trial of sacrifice," Eric said. "Once you step through, there is no turning back." Maurice took a shaky breath. "And what happens if I fail?" Eric's silence was all the answer he needed. "Great," Maurice muttered. He approached the gateway, the Callstone's hum intensifying. When he placed his hand on the cold stone, the runes flared to life, and the void rippled. "You're ready," Eric said. "The Callstone chose you for a reason." Maurice glanced back. "What if it's wrong? What if I'm not enough?" Eric's gaze softened. "You are enough." With a deep breath, Maurice stepped through the gateway. The sensation was unlike anything he had experienced, like falling and floating at the same time. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in a vast expanse. The ground beneath him was smooth and reflective, like glass, and the sky above was an endless void of stars. "Welcome, bearer," a voice echoed, deep and resonant. "Yeah, hi," Maurice said, trying to sound braver than he felt. "What's this big sacrifice I'm supposed to make?" The ground beneath him began to shift, forming a massive circle. Within the circle, images appeared. His mother, his old friend, the woman he had loved and lost. And then, to his shock, himself. "These are the pieces of your life," the voice said. "Your choices brought you here, but the path forward requires a sacrifice. To wield the power of the Callstone, you must let go of what anchors you." Maurice frowned. "Let go? What does that even mean?" The images replayed scenes from his life, his mother's laughter, the arguments with his friend, the night he walked away from the woman who begged him to stay. Each memory was a knife to the heart, cutting deeper with every second. "You must choose," the voice said. "What will you sacrifice to move forward? Your past or your future?" Maurice's heart pounded. How the hell am I supposed to choose between that? "To hold the power of the callstone," the voice continued, "you must give up what chains you. Your past defines you, but it also binds you. Let it go, and you will gain the strength to wield the stone." Maurice closed his eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The memories replayed in his mind, each one a reminder of what he had lost, and what he still carried with him. "I'm tired," he said finally, his voice trembling. "Tired of holding on to things I can't change. If letting go of the past means I can move forward, then so be it." The images faded, replaced by a blinding light that enveloped him. The callstone's hum reached a crescendo, and for a moment Maurice felt like he was floating, free of pain, free of doubt. When the light faded, he was back on the summit. Eric stood before him, a faint smile on his lips. "You did it," Eric said. Maurice nodded, his body trembling. "Barely. What now?" Eric stepped aside, revealing the callstone, now glowing brighter than ever. "It is yours, bearer. Its power is yours to wield. But remember, the callstone's power is not a gift. It is a responsibility." Maurice stared at the stone, its light reflecting in his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't dared to feel: hope. "Responsibility, huh?" he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Guess I'd better not screw it up." Eric chuckled. "The callstone chose well." As Maurice reached for the stone, the hum grew softer, almost like a heartbeat. When his hand touched its surface, a surge of energy coursed through him, filling him with a strength he hadn't known he possessed. The journey had been long, painful, and uncertain, but as Maurice stood on the summit, the callstone in his hand, he realized it had all been worth it. He wasn't the same man who had started this journey. He was something more. The sky above began to shift, the stars forming a path that stretched beyond the horizon. Maurice took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the stone. "Let's see where this takes me," he said, stepping forward into the unknown.